This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below.
Deciding to move on from a quarterback that you've signed to a long-term deal is not that dissimilar to a divorce, or at least how I see it, because there is the one thing of coming to the decision that this quarterback and this team just don't need to be together anymore. But then there is the whole process of separating these two today, and that's what today's video is about. I'm going to propose my plan to move on from the Watson era. Again, it's a lame duck era. We know it's over. We're just waiting for it to be official, right? Basically, when somebody going to get kicked out the house, who's going to move out first, all of this stuff that we're trying to figure out here. So what's the plan to move on? What do the steps look like? In my opinion, let's talk about it. Step one, recognizing the problem. Right now, I think the Browns are in denial about this whole thing and about how bad this whole thing is. The reason I think they are in denial, and I'm talking about the front office, maybe even Deshaun Watson, and even including Kevin Stefanski. The reason I think they are in denial is because this thing has blown up so fast, so bad, that nobody anticipated being this bad. I think they anticipated that they might not want to start Watson after this year. That could be something that they anticipated for. I think they might have been able to anticipate that the season would go bad in a longer, more drawn out way. But this blowing up to this point to where it's at an absolute fever pitch with the fan base and the media about whether Watson can remain the starter going forward, they did not expect to be here in week 5. And I think they're in denial about it, right? I think they're trying to convince themselves if they just get a better effort from the offensive line, you can fix this. I think they're just trying to convince themselves that if you get better effort from your wide receivers, you can fix this. I think they're trying to convince themselves that, maybe Nick Chubb coming back will increase the effort of the offensive line, of the wide receivers, and that can fix this. But the problem is that the effort is low for the offensive line because they have low faith in their quarterback. The effort is low from the wide receivers because they have no faith in their quarterback, and they have no faith in their quarterback, not based off of what's happened in these first 5 games, but they have no faith because they've been watching Deshaun Watson look like this since OTAs. We can postpone the inevitable all we want. So once you recognize the problem, once you recognize that something needs to be done, and that something is probably starts with benching the quarterback, right? It doesn't fix every problem on the team, but it certainly gives you a chance to evaluate the other problems on the team. Then you get to step 2, which is coalition building. The reality of benching a quarterback with as much guaranteed money as Deshaun Watson has left is not simple, right? It's not a simple choice of Kevin Stefanski going on his whiteboard, getting the Deshaun Watson plaque and moving it down and moving up the Jameis Winston one. You can make it seem like it's that simple, but it's just not that simple. There's a lot of things that you have to navigate, right? If Kevin's going to bench Deshaun Watson, Jimmy Haslam has to be at least okay with it, right? This can't be something that takes the owner by surprise. And we could talk about whether that's something that you want in an organization or don't want in an organization. But the truth is that you're not going to be able to make a move like this no matter who you are, even if you're Bill Belichick, to move on from a quarterback that you spent this much money on just by yourself as the coach. You have to make sure that there's some form of a consensus with everybody in that organization, and that's the sound thing to do. I know a lot of people are making the reports or making it seem like Jimmy Haslam is forcing Kevin Stefanski to start Deshaun Watson. I don't think that's the case. I think Kevin Stefanski is in denial because he didn't expect Deshaun Watson to be this bad this fast. I think Andrew Berry is in denial. And maybe they're scrapping something together to put together, but they clearly were caught off guard, were blindsided by the fact that Deshaun is this bad this early. Maybe they anticipated that he'd be mediocre, but right now Deshaun is worse than mediocre, which is why coalition building is important, because you got to present a case to Jimmy Haslam. You got to present a case to the rest of the people who help make decisions for the Cleveland Browns to bench Deshaun Watson. That's just how it's going to work with every single team in the NFL when it comes to a decision like this. And you got to make sure that there's not just consensus between you, Andrew Berry, and Jimmy Haslam, but there's a consensus in that locker room that people, team leaders like Myles Garrett, are okay with moving on from the Watson era, that team leaders like Nick Chubb are okay with moving on from the Watson era. You got to make sure you have your coalition ready to make the move, because you're not going to successfully bench him if one person makes that move. You got to have a coalition of people in charge who are leaders in this locker room make that move. Going rogue here and doing something independently is a bad move. It might satisfy you in the short term, but it's a bad move. So you got to coalition build. And when it comes to coalition building, that could take weeks, that could take months, it could take hours if the problem is bad enough, right? It really just depends on how bad Deshaun Watson plays. Right now, while Deshaun Watson has put up some of the worst film you've seen all year, he has not thrown a ton of interceptions, which might be keeping him above water. If he comes out against Philly and throws 4 interceptions, then I think this coalition will be built within a matter of hours, days after that game. If he continues to do what he's doing, it's going to take a couple weeks to build that coalition. But you got to build a coalition in that building to make sure that everybody, or at least everybody, will get behind the next guy that you put out there. And this is an important thing to think about, man. As much as ignoring the will of your locker room and playing Deshaun Watson, regardless of how the locker room feels about it, will lose you the locker room, another thing that can lose you the locker room is if you don't ever even consider the will of the locker room in a massive decision you make. You got to make sure that the locker room is with you on this. If you want to bench Watson, they got to make sure that you have the locker room leaders on this. Because again, the reason you're benching Watson is so you don't lose the locker room. And if you do it in a way that doesn't consider them, there's still a chance that you lose the locker room. You have to build that coalition. Then you get to step 3, you get all that stuff, and you convince Jimmy Haslam to get off the fence. You're asking Jimmy Haslam to personally punt $150 million and to spend cash in the long run so you can mitigate the damage on the salary cap that the contract that you pushed Jimmy Haslam to sign is creating. You have to make sure that you have a complete argument to convince him to get behind this. It's not going to be enough that people like me and you want Deshaun Watson to be benched. It's not going to be enough that the radio is saying that Deshaun Watson to be benched and that the ESPN is saying it, right? You're going to have to put together a firm statistical argument in front of Jimmy Haslam, and you're going to also have to put together a strong emotional argument, right? You have to identify the problem and then show Jimmy Haslam that, hey, man, it looks like it's the quarterback that's the problem, and explain it to him. And then you're going to also have to show him that the locker room emotionally wants to move on from Deshaun Watson. You got to show Jimmy Haslam that this is inevitable. And it's about if you want to get ahead of it or get behind it. Jimmy Haslam is not a great owner. I don't believe that great owners exist, but I don't believe Jimmy Haslam to be a man without sense. And Jimmy Haslam has demonstrated in his career with the Browns and without the Browns that when he sees a Titanic sinking in the ocean, he's smart enough to get on a lifeboat and get out of there. He did it with Pilot Flying J, he did it with Hugh Jackson, and he did it with John Dorsey. Once he realized that those guys have attached themselves to sinking ships, got right off of it. If you convince him that this ship is sinking and there's nothing you can do about it, Jimmy will get off of it. He's not going to force you to start Deshaun Watson out of spite. but you gotta make a sufficient argument. You can't just go up here and say the fans are mad. You gotta give them a statistical argument. You gotta identify the problem, and you gotta put together a coalition of team leaders to say, hey man, this ain't gonna work. You gotta make it inevitable to Jimmy Haslam, and you gotta paint that picture super clean. Once you do that, you will get the green light to bench Deshaun Watson. And then we're talking about what's next when it comes to the long term. So this right here, this step 4 is when this thing branches off into 3 separate timelines that the Browns could follow. So first things first, you would put in Jameis no matter what. Jameis, and you'll build around the run. You'll put Jameis Winston at quarterback. You'll build around the run. This is just for the short term to see what you can salvage out this season. And if that works well, you'll stick with it for next year, right? So you'll have Jameis be the starter for the rest of 2024, and then you'll figure out whatever you need to figure out financially to make him the starter for 2025, and Jameis will just be your bridge guy for however long that Jameis needs to be your bridge guy. That is timeline A. If Jameis doesn't work, let's say Jameis goes in there and he is a disaster. Well, then you start asking questions also about Kevin, right? Because if the whole thing was that Deshaun was the problem, you take Deshaun out, the offense still stinks. Well, then you got to start looking at other guys who are the problem. So now you're starting to evaluate if it's the head coach. But if Jameis plays bad, you put DTR in, and then DTR plays. Okay, maybe Jameis stunk too. Then it was Deshaun that stunk, but DTR is playing fine. You keep the coach, and you continue out with DTR. And that would actually be like long-term, probably best case scenario. It's not very likely that that works out that way, but it would be the best case scenario from a salary cap perspective. I'll get into that in just a minute. If both A and B fail, so both Jameis Winston, plan A, and then DTR, plan B, both fell, then you end up in plan C. And plan C gets a little dicey, right? Because you're talking about 2 quarterbacks not working, and you're really questioning the Stefanski system at that point. Now, I think Stefanski will survive 2024 no matter what. He just signed a new deal, but he would immediately be on the hottest of hot seats in 2025. Now, some of you might be asking, well, what's going to happen with Deshaun Watson's contract? So one, if Deshaun Watson gets suspended, then you would just wait until June 1st to cut him. Then you would cut him and pretty much move on with minimal financial impact from Deshaun Watson going forward. This doesn't really change the plan as much as I thought it would, because a lot of this plan is about long-term solutions. And Deshaun Watson getting suspended only really has large benefits for you once you end up in plan C. And I'll discuss that in just a moment. Now, if Watson doesn't get suspended, and we have to prepare for this possibility, he would just go on a paid vacation for the rest of the year, right? So you just send him home for the rest of 2024. Tell him not to come back into the building. He will probably oblige by that. During that time, you can work out a restructure with Watson that would allow you to move his money down the line till about 2030. Remember, the reason the Browns want to do this, and the reason it's good that the Browns do this, is because the salary cap goes up by 8% at the very least every year. It goes up higher sometimes. Last year, it went up by over 10%. But the salary cap goes up every year with league revenues, which means by 2030, the salary cap will at least be around $400 million, if not more. So the longer you spread the money out for Deshaun Watson, the less impact overall that money has on the cap. So let's just do some quick napkin math here. Deshaun has about $170 million in cap hits that you have to account for. If you spread this out and restructure this until the end of 2030 and you spread it evenly, which they probably wouldn't do, but if you spread it evenly, it would be about $28 million a year. Now, by 2030, that $28 million a year that might sound steep right now is only 7% of the cap, which is equivalent to a player in 2024 getting $17 million. So by spreading the money out throughout the cap, you're actually making it so that you're more flexible with the salary cap in the long term. Now, another question, why would Watson agree to a restructure if the Browns have basically said that they're going to move on from him? Well, Watson would want it to be easier for the Browns to release him if it was made clear by the Cleveland Browns that they no longer plan to play him at the quarterback position. One thing I think people get wrong about Deshaun Watson at this point is assuming that like he got this contract and he doesn't want to play good anymore. Playing good football is the only way for Deshaun Watson to potentially salvage what's left of his off the field reputation. I think he really, really wants to play more than anybody on the Cleveland Browns for that selfish reason, because he needs to rehab his reputation. And the only way he can rehab his reputation is if he plays good football. He is well aware of that dynamic. And maybe that dynamic has made him play worse football over the years. I don't care to do the analysis on that. But what I do know is that this dude's probably going to want to play. He's not going to want to sit the bench or be off the team but getting paid for the next 3 years. So he will work out a restructure so it can be easier for the Browns to cut him so he could potentially sign somewhere else. Now, does anybody else sign Watson? I highly doubt it. But I think he has to take the chance, because if he just plays out this contract sitting at home for the next 2.5 years, he ain't never going to play football again. Now, maybe some of y'all are right and he does not want to play football and he's fine with that and he doesn't restructure. Even if that's the case, I think the Browns are fine. But I think he'll be likely to restructure because he's going to want to try to play football somewhere else. And this is where that guaranteed contract also becomes a prison to Deshaun Watson. If he wants to play, but the Browns don't want to play him, he has to work something out with the team in order to get released, because he can't just demand a trade or not show up, because that would avoid his guarantees. So I think you'll get cooperation from Watson to get whatever restructure you want to do for this contract. You could Bobby Bonilla this thing and just push it out 25 years down the line. It wouldn't matter. But that's what they're going to do with Deshaun Watson's contract. They're just going to figure out a way to restructure that with him so they can cut him as soon as possible, probably June 1st. How the restructure is structured will greatly vary by how the Browns feel about DTR, or how the Browns feel about the 2025 draft class or the 2026 draft class. Like it really depends on where they're targeting to get their next franchise quarterback, on how that restructure is going to work. But they will get a restructure if they move on from Deshaun Watson. And in that scenario where Deshaun doesn't get suspended, but the Browns still move on from him, the general philosophy for the Browns will be you want to stay under $10 million for a quarterback in free agency, or you want to have a quarterback on a rookie deal until about 2029. Why the year 2029? Because that's going to be the first year a quarterback that's drafted in the earliest draft class, which is 2025, would be eligible for an extension. So you want to be at a place to where you can have all that Deshaun Watson money probably cleared up or mostly taken care of, so you can extend a quarterback that you draft either in 2025 or 2026. So for the next couple of years, again, it will be quarterbacks on their rookie deal or quarterbacks who are under $10 million free agents. So you would basically start journeyman in like DTR types, right, that you draft. Now we're going to get into the branching scenarios here. Now that we're past step 4, let's go to step 5A, which is the Jameis timeline, the timeline where Jameis Winston can be your bridge starting quarterback. Now, in this scenario, I think you got to evaluate 2 things. One, how do you feel about the next 2 quarterback drafts? Do you feel like any of these drafts have prospects you believe can realistically be a franchise quarterback? Don't tell yourself this guy can be Kirk Cousins. This guy can be a bridge quarterback. This guy could be a decent starter. No, I don't care if you think that that might be possible for a quarterback, especially if you're drafting that quarterback in the first round. If you're drafting a quarterback in the first round, you have to believe that they could be a franchise quarterback. Anybody else who is anything less than that will set the team back for 3 years. You have to believe they're a franchise quarterback. So when you go in 2025's draft and you go in 2026's draft, you have to ask yourself that question. Do I believe there are franchise quarterbacks in this draft? Then you have to look at DTR and ask yourself, do I believe he can be a bridge quarterback? Because if you believe DTR can be a bridge quarterback as soon as 2026 or 2025, then you would move on from Jameis and put DTR as the starter. The reason you would do that is DTR is cheaper. Another thing to consider when talking about why the Browns could go to DTR as early as 2025, even if Jameis plays well enough to establish that he could be a bridge quarterback in this offense, is one, yes, DTR is cheaper, but also the downside of DTR playing in 2025 is that he might be bad. But if he's bad and the team stinks, you're probably going to have a really good draft pick to go after a quarterback in the 2026 draft, where there are multiple guys that people are highly ranking and excited about, right? But Arch Manning is in that draft class, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe that might be what the Browns want to do regardless, because you do have that benefit of like the upside is that DTR plays well and maybe he could be your franchise quarterback, or DTR plays well and he could be your bridge quarterback while you develop whoever you want to draft. And if DTR plays well, you have another asset that you can use to trade up in the draft to get your guy in 2026 or whenever that may be the case, right? Because he would still be a young quarterback under a rookie deal that you could move up for, and that would give you some extra capital to kind of get in the draft wherever you need to get in the draft to draft your guy. So no matter how well Jameis plays in this plan A, you're probably going to want to get to DTR if your plan is to get your next quarterback in the draft, because if DTR stinks, it raises your chances of getting a quarterback in the draft. If DTR plays well, it raises your chances of getting a quarterback in the draft while also not having bad quarterback play during that time. Now let's talk about the 2025 quarterback draft class for a second. Now I'm going to be very honest here. I'm very, 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 very early into looking into the 2025 draft class right now, which means my opinions will likely evolve on this subject. So I'm going to reserve the right to evolve my opinion because, again, very early. I haven't been able to watch everybody, haven't been able to watch all 22 film of these guys. But if you're just telling me from when I've been able to catch a game on Saturdays and watch these quarterbacks play, who the quarterback I like the most is, it's Jalen Milroe. That's a guy I think could work well in the Cleveland Browns system under Kevin Stefanski, who I think can do all the things that Kevin wants him to do. You're probably going to have to develop him for a little bit, but I think he will be worthwhile. Plus that plus athletic ability is something that I look for when you're determining if a quarterback is pro ready. We've made this mistake for multiple years in the draft of saying the most pro ready guy is the quarterback who plays a style similar to what you see in the NFL, but usually the quarterback who hits the ground running the most are the most athletically talented quarterbacks in the draft, right? You go back to 2017, and the quarterbacks that hit the ground running were the most athletically talented ones, Deshaun Watson and Patrick Mahomes. You know who didn't hit the ground running was the most pro-ready guy in Mitchell Trubisky. You go to 2018, right? The pro-ready guy in that draft was, hilariously enough, Josh Rosen. The projects in that draft were Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson. Well, Lamar Jackson won the MVP in 2019, and by 2020, Josh Allen had become a franchise quarterback. We're just now in 2024, and we're seeing the other pro-ready guys in Sam Darnold and Baker Mayfield start to get a foothold in a Pro Bowl level NFL career consistently, and that's the key, consistently. 19, Kyler Murray is the first quarterback that hits the ground running because he's the most athletically talented in the 2019 draft. 2020, right between Tua and Justin Herbert. Obviously, Joe Burrow was the number one overall pick. He had all these skills that you needed. But between Tua and Justin Herbert, there was this idea that Tua was going to be much more pro-ready because he played in a pro-style system in Alabama, and Justin Herbert was going to take forever to develop because Justin Herbert played in this wild spread in Oregon. Well, then Justin Herbert hit the ground running first because he was just more athletically gifted. I'm going to continue to beat this point home because a lot of people have this misconception about pro-ready quarterbacks and what pro-ready actually means. Think about it like this. You know how much different college football is to the NFL and how much different in complexity it is for the quarterback and how much different it is in speed for the quarterback. What's going to help a quarterback adjust faster? running some complex systems in college, or just being able to run away from these athletes fast enough. Bryce Young is the final example I would use here. He was the pro-ready guy in the 2023 draft. People thought that C.J. Stroud had cognitive issues in that draft class, and he ended up being a better player. He wasn't pro-ready, but he was more physically talented than Bryce Young. And even somebody like Anthony Richardson, who struggled in his early career, his struggles haven't been nearly as bad or as gnarly as Bryce Young's struggles have been. And you would take the issues that Anthony Richardson has over Bryce Young, even at this early stage of their career. The whole pro-ready thing is kind of a myth here when it comes to the quarterback position, if you look at it from how we traditionally look at pro-ready. When I look at pro-ready quarterbacks, I look for the best athlete in that class. And the best athlete in this draft class at the quarterback position is Jalen Milroe. The player who's played the best competition in this draft class is Jalen Milroe. The player who's had the best games versus the best competition is Jalen Milroe. I understand he's not number one in a lot of the key stat categories that people look at, but he's number one against He's number one in those categories, and those are the categories that I care about. Also, when I watch him play, I see somebody who is more comfortable than people give him credit for in the pocket. He is capable of throwing on time and timing his throws with his footwork, which is really key in the Kevin Stefanski system. And I think he has the ability to develop into somebody who can make plus throws down the field. Now, I would like to see him use the middle of the field more. I would like to see him get a little bit more comfortable in the pocket. And I do wonder about if he will have flighty feet early in his career because he's so used to being the best athlete on the field. But those are problems that coaching can fix. If he's within reach, and he continues to look how he looks, and if I go into the All-22 and all of that holds up for Jalen Milroe, then that's the guy I think is worth a top 5 pick in this draft. I know a lot of people aren't there yet with Jalen Milroe, but I see somebody there in Jalen where I'm like, I wouldn't mind drafting this guy at any point in the first round. And that's important to me. My personal belief is that if you're not comfortable taking a quarterback potentially within the top 5 of an NFL draft, you should probably never draft that guy in the first round. The reason I think that is because the consequence for drafting somebody in the top 5 and in the top 25 at the quarterback position is pretty much identical. Outside of like the salary being a little different, the consequence is the same. You're going to have to give that guy 2 to 3 years to start, and you're going to have to pause the franchise to see if this guy can play. But if you draft that guy in the top 5 and you think that guy is worth a top 5 pick, then you are saying to yourself, you feel like you have a good chance of that working out. Now, on the flip side, if you like a quarterback prospect, but not enough to take within the top 5, but enough to take in 20, then you're telling yourself already that you don't really believe in that quarterback to begin with, which means that that quarterback probably has a lesser chance of working out, but you're still going to hold the team up for 2 to 3 years to test this guy out as the starter, because you got to, because you took him in the first round. It doesn't matter where you take a quarterback in the first round. You take a quarterback in the first round, you got to give him 2 to 3 years to work that out. That's how that's going to work. Yes, there are outliers to this, but most of the quarterbacks who are drafted in the first round, they get 2 to 3 years to work it out. So if you're going to stop the franchise in the hopes of drafting somebody in the first round who can be a franchise quarterback, then you should only do that for somebody you truly believe is a franchise quarterback. And if you believe somebody is a franchise quarterback, you should be willing to take them with the number 1 overall pick, number 2 overall pick, no matter where you are in the draft class, because a franchise quarterback is going to be worth the number 1 overall pick almost every draft class. I think Jalen Milroe has the potential to be a franchise quarterback in the NFL. So I don't care where you are, I would take him. I don't feel that way yet about any of the other quarterbacks in this draft class. From what I've seen for Cam Ward, I'm not overly impressed. I see somebody who holds the ball long and kind of plays college ball, where he just kind of scrambles back there and just throws it up. I'm not impressed with what I've seen from Cam Ward. Now, again, I need to see more from Cam Ward. I'm probably going to have to look at more tape from him, but I'm not impressed. Quinn Ewers, I have not watched a ton of Quinn Ewers this year. Curtis Rourke, I've heard good things, but I have not watched a ton of Curtis Rourke this year. From what I've seen from Carson Beck, I'm not impressed. And with Shedeur Sanders, I have seen some of Shedeur. I am intrigued by what I've seen from Shedeur, but I also need to see Shedeur play better versus good teams before I can feel comfortable about any team taking him in the first round. Because if you draft Shedeur Sanders, you're also drafting the circus that comes with him. Right? You're drafting the Sanders family. You're drafting Deion Sanders' opinion about whatever you're doing as an organization. You're drafting Sanders fans who are going to want to fire your coach and hire Deion Sanders as your head coach. Like, you're drafting the circus there. And if you're going to draft somebody like Shedeur Sanders, and I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but if you're going to draft somebody like Shedeur Sanders, you have to feel like there is no doubt that that dude is a franchise quarterback, especially if you're a team like the Browns who wants to keep things stable, because that is a recipe for a coup if I've ever seen one. Again, it's super early. Right now, I like Milroe the most. That could change by the time we get close to the draft. It's not really that deep. But if the Browns feel that way about Milroe or Sanders or Rourke or whoever they feel that way about, and they get their QB1 in 2025's draft, then you basically move on with the bridge quarterback, and then your future QB1, you start your QB1, and that era starts there, and you're done with the Watson era, on to a next one within a year, which would be pretty quick. Plan 5B, right? The B timeline here is the scenario where DTR ends up being your bridge quarterback. Now, financially, this will be the best case scenario for the Cleveland Browns. It would basically muzzle any blow that the Deshaun Watson contract situation could have on your future finances, because it just wouldn't matter, because you're starting a quarterback who's making $1 million a year until 2026. Like, your starter would be making so little that you'll be able to be fine paying Deshaun Watson whatever you restructure him to for the rest of that deal, in order to just move on. The other reason this would be perfect for the Browns financially is that, again, if DTR plays well enough to be the bridge starter, you're talking about having a starter for 2025 and for 2026, right? Like, playing DTR for 2.5 years while he's under a super cheap contract. The reason that's important is it gives you a lot of flexibility. If you love somebody in the 2025 draft and you're in reach, you take that guy in the 2025 draft. But if you don't love anybody in this draft, or the guy that you do love, you can't get in reach of, you're fine with playing DTR for the rest of 2025 and then rolling into 2026 and hoping that you can get in reach of another quarterback that you like in a much stronger quarterback draft class. There's also the unlikely but added value that DTR could just, like, he's young enough to emerge as the starter. It'd be very improbable. But if DTR played to a franchise level, then obviously that would be a magic pill that solves all your problems. This is also a possibility with Jameis, right, that he could evolve into a franchise quarterback, but Jameis is already 30, so it's not a long-term thing. It would be a short-term thing, even if he plays to that level. With DTR, at the end of his contract, he'd be 27, so you would just have a franchise quarterback for at least another 3 years, and you would be well within another era. So that is the financially best-case scenario for the Browns going forward. Let's go into Plan C, the third branch of this plan. Now, Plan C is if Jameis and DTR are both below average bridge quality quarterbacks. This is the one scenario where Watson getting suspended would be a massive deal for the Cleveland Browns, because if Watson gets suspended and these two don't work out, then you're going to think about bringing in a higher quality bridge quarterback to hold you over for potentially the next couple of years to 4 years, right? You're talking about a Kirk Cousins, probably somebody a little bit younger, like a Derek Carr or something like that, right? Like somebody who's not going to be the greatest quarterback in the world, but you think that Kevin Stefanski could work with. I'm not being super specific. I'm not married to those two quarterbacks. It could be anybody else who becomes available. But that's part of what you would do if you got the suspension. If you don't get the suspension for Deshaun Watson, and the DTR and Jameis prove to not be bridge quality quarterbacks, then you end up in the worst case, kind of best case scenario. It depends on how willing you are to live through a bad season. Because if both those guys don't work out and you're dealing with the suspension, then you're probably just going to play it really cheap at quarterback and then just try to get the best draft positioning possible for 2026 to get your franchise quarterback, hopefully, in the 2026 draft. Either way, no matter how you look at this, the Browns are going to probably try to move on to their next quarterback era by the latest in the 2026 draft. So that's what moving on from Deshaun Watson looks like. I think a lot of people are going to make a big deal about the money's impact on moving on from Deshaun Watson. And while that does have a big impact on Jimmy Haslam's bank account, when it comes to the salary cap, which is separate from Jimmy Haslam's bank account, it does not have that same effect because there are ways that you can manipulate that money to where it doesn't affect you as much as people are going to assume it does. And Kevin and Andrew Berry has proven himself savvy enough with this kind of thing to where he can be able to do it. So I'm not really worried about not being able to keep Miles or not being able to keep any key player under the age of 26 on the Cleveland Browns long term. The Browns will be able to extend whoever they want, whoever they need to extend, like Martin Emerson, these guys. They'll be able to keep their good young players, and they're going to want to keep their good young players because this is a team that's going to try to jump into another era as soon as 2025 or maybe even 2026, but we're only talking about a year or two where they feel like they're going to be down, say, quote unquote, before they're up to their next era. But that's my plan to move on from the Watson era, short term and long term. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.